What is neo-behaviorism? While behaviorism means the prediction and control of human behavior, in which introspection and our independent thinking play no essential part of its teaching methods, neo-behaviorism refers to a behavior that cannot be fully understood simply in terms of observable stimuli and reactions. It introduces mediating variables into the behaviorist stimulus-response scheme.
So who is Edward Chase Tolman? Edward Chase Tolman was born on April 14, 1886 and died on November 19, 1959. He was an American psychologist and a psychology professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Tolman's beliefs and works has helped to establish what is now known as purposive behaviorism, a discipline of psychology. According to a 2002 review of General Psychology Pool, Tolman was the 45th most cited psychologist of the 20th century. Tolman was one of the leading figures in protecting academic freedom during the McCarthy era in the early 1950s. In recognition of Tolman's contributions to both the development of psychology and academic freedom, the Education and Psychology building on Berkeley campus has established a Tolman Hall, and it was named after him. So what was his experiment? Edward Chase Tolman is well known for his experiments with rats and mazes. His famous theories and experiments are latent learning and cognitive maps. Latent learning is a type of learning that occurs but does not become apparent until there is an incentive that serves as a catalyst to demonstrate that learning. To further explain the latent learning, here is an example. A child might learn how to complete a math problem in class, but this learning is not immediately apparent. Only when the child is offered some form of reinforcement for completing the problem does this learning reveal itself. Furthermore, Edward Tolman conducted tests in which groups of rats ran a labyrinth. Animals that did not originally get a reward learned the path during the non-reward trials. However, after the rats were given incentives, they were able to refer to their cognitive map of the route. These findings prove that learning may occur even when an organism does not show it straight away. Another example is your knowledge of different routes in your hometown. Every day, you take different routes and discover the locations of various businesses around your town. However, because you are not using it most of the time, this learning has become dormant, and it is only activated when necessity takes place, such as when you need to discover a specific location, such as the nearby coffee shop or bus stop. Then you are obliged to draw on or display your knowledge or what you have learned. Based on the examples, it clearly portrays that sometimes learning only becomes evident when we need to utilize it. According to psychologists, this hidden learning that only manifests itself when reinforcement is offered is known as latent learning. Now, to explain further and to provide more examples of latent learning, here is Tamara Lorenzo. And right after, George Reyes will discuss the cognitive maps in a detailed manner.
Perhaps his work with rats and mazes is what makes Tolman most well known. Tolman's concepts of latent learning and cognitive maps helped pave the way for the rise of cognitive psychology. His theory of latent learning suggests that learning occurs even if no reinforcement is offered. Latent learning is not necessarily apparent at the time, but that appears later in situations where it is needed. Let me give you a few examples. Let's say that your math teacher has introduced a new concept to your class. You find it hard to digest the concepts and execute the methods, but at the time of your examination, you find yourself actually writing down the equations, recalling the procedures for the problems, and actually arriving at an answer. That is actually latent learning. You realize that you have been learning every day by listening to your teacher and watching her solve problems. However, this learning did not become apparent until You had to solve the problems yourself. And the reward in this situation is acing the exam.
So, what are cognitive maps? A cognitive map is a mental representation of the layout of one's environment. It helps people recall and learn information about the physical environment and are created by picking up on environmental signals and cues. Also, it helps people navigate both familiar and unfamiliar areas. It can be applied at different scales, from finding the bathroom down the hallway to navigating across town. Examples of cognitive maps is when a person guides his or her friend to his or her own house. When a student made himself or herself remember the path going to his or her school. And when a teacher drives his or her car going to his or her house without using any tracker or a GPS.
The American psychologist Albert Bandura, who was born in Canada, is the father of social learning theory. He is generally best known for his modeling experiment on aggression, commonly known as the Boo Boo Doll experiment, which showed that children can learn behaviors by watching adults. The foundation of the so-called social learning theory is Bandura's discovery that humans are capable of being profoundly influenced by the actions of others. He adheres to the social learning theory, which emphasizes the learning that takes place in a social setting where imitation happens after exposure to either a circumstance that actually occurs in real life or simply by viewing a film that depicts the same situation. Bandura's study on aggression, the experiment for which he is perhaps best known, was carried out in 1961 at Stanford University, where Bandura was a professor. The subjects were preschoolers, small children aged 3 to 5 at Stanford's nursery school, and were divided into 3 groups. One group observed aggressive adult behavior models, second group observed non-aggressive behavior models, and the third group was exposed to a film showing aggressive adult behavior models. In the first group, he put an adult in a room with a child and a bunch of toys, including something called the Boo Boo Doll, which is a giant inflatable doll. After a minute, every child had an aggressive expression on their face and started beating the doll in a very vicious manner, shouting, screaming, kicking, and hitting with a hammer. And this went on for about 10 minutes. Every child who watched the adult being violent copied much of what they'd seen. The closest imitation was when a child observed an adult of the same sex. In the second group, which had watched an adult play gently and calmly, showing no signs of aggression. 2 years later, he reran his experiment on the third group by watching an aggressive adult on film. The children have 2 versions of the film. One is a straightforward recording of the adult beating up the Boo Boo Doll, and the second one is a fantasy version with a dog attacking while dressed as a cat. In almost every case, Bandura got the same results. Children imitated what they saw. This was one of the first experiments to look at the impact of television violence. The complicated relationship between TV and the behavior is still being debated, but it was Bandura who opened the floodgates and launched an entirely new area of research. In conclusion, this experiment supports a social learning theory that argues humans learn primarily through observation and modeling. Beyond the concept that learning comes from first-hand interaction with the environment, Bandura's theory goes further.
What did you derive out of the experiment?
that children are able to learn social behaviors such as aggression through the process of observation learning through watching the behavior of another person. This study has important implications for the effects of media violence on children. The findings supports Bandura's 1977 social learning theory, which states that applications of the social learning theory may be particularly valuable as they can empower people to recognize and trace roots of their issues, identify patterns they may have not otherwise seen, and ultimately break the habits and behaviors that harm them.